Many years ago, during summer and fall, our parents often took us on weekend camping trips. We usually went to the same place, which I recall like this. We'd drive about 30 miles out of town on a country road, then turn onto a dirt road that wound up a mountain. The area was perfect for outdoor activities like dirt biking, shooting, hiking, whatever people like to do. We followed the road up into the woods, where smaller paths branched off into nowhere. If you continued far enough, you'd come to an old, abandoned quarry. Not huge, but with a few big blast holes and piles of broken granite. My sister and I loved it. It was a fun spot to explore while camping. Not many people went past the quarry, maybe because they thought it was still in use or assumed there was some industrial activity further on. After the quarry, though, there was nothing but open space for camping, and we always picked the flattest spot. We had it all to ourselves. This trip started off just like all the others, with sunshine and laughter as we made our way to the familiar campsite. The dirt road led us through fields of tall grass, scattered pine and oak trees, and large rocks. We set up a simple camp: a tent, a table with folding chairs, and a fire pit surrounded by flat stones, perfect for warming up coffee or hot chocolate. It was a blast. We drank soda and set up cans on the hillside to shoot at with BB guns and a small .22 rifle. My dad loved teaching us how to handle a gun, and my sister and I enjoyed it too. We also went hiking, gathering firewood and carving small pieces into shapes like animals or ornaments. Sometimes we'd just hang around camp, reading while the natural sounds of the forest filled the air. Our favorite thing was going to the lake near camp. The road would split. One path leading to a dead end at a big iron gate marked no access. This used to be the road to the lake, but it was closed due to parking problems and other hazards. A newer, easier to access road had been built in the 50s or 60s, so most people used that instead. As a result, the old path and the surrounding campsites were almost always empty. My sister and I practically had the whole place to ourselves, free to wander without adult supervision. We'd spend hours skipping stones and trying to catch fish. One morning, right at sunrise, we woke up excited to head to the lake for some early fishing. We grabbed our gear and walked side by side down the dusty road towards the iron gate, about 3/4 of a mile away. It was another half-mile down the hill to the lake, a walk that took about 25 minutes. As we neared the gate, everything seemed normal until I noticed a car parked in front of it. It wasn't unusual for someone to know about this lesser-known entrance, so I figured it was an early morning fisherman trying to get some quiet time before the lake got crowded. But as we got closer, I saw two people sitting in the car. The car wasn't new or old, and it wasn't especially fancy or beat up. It was just ordinary, the kind of car you wouldn't really remember. For doors, for tires, and the engine off. The windows were down, and the people inside were talking quietly. When they noticed us, they hushed each other. And then the man in the driver's seat leaned out and called out in a cheerful voice, "Good morning, kids." His friendliness put me at ease. There was a woman sitting next to him, and from first impressions, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We responded with a good morning in unison. I was holding my fishing gear, so only my sister waved. "Isn't it a bit early for you guys? Where are your parents?" the man asked. "They're back at camp," I said, gesturing over my shoulder. "They'll be down later after breakfast." "Well, you two be careful," the woman added. "It's a long way down." "Thanks," we replied together, turning back towards the lake. At first, it didn't seem strange to us, just some friendly people. But as we walked away, the man called out again, making me stop and turn around. "Is that your sister?" he asked, his tone suddenly off. "Yeah," I said, feeling a little uneasy. "Why do you ask?" "Just be careful, you never know what's out here," he said, and both he and the woman gave us creepy smiles that stretched wide and toothy. In a moment, they went from friendly to unsettling. I quickly caught up to my sister, who was obliviously walking ahead. We kept moving, but the encounter left me with a lingering sense of dread. They shouted a few more odd phrases after us, things that sounded like movie quotes or foreign words, but I didn't stick around to listen closely. As we got closer to the lake, we tried to shake off the weird encounter and focus on fishing. The water was calm, the sky was clear, and we had the lake to ourselves. We set up and started fishing, but after some time in the sun, we decided to move to a shady spot near some rocks. We caught a few fish, but then my sister pointed to something in the water. It was a blood stain, dried and caked onto the rocks we were standing on. I didn't panic. Blood wasn't unusual in fishing spots, but then a pair of dress shoes floated by. Fancy shoes. One of them had blood inside. I immediately thought of the couple we saw earlier and got a bad feeling. My sister and I quickly decided to pack up and head back to camp. As we hiked up the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was off. When we reached the top, the car was still there, but the people were gone. Relief washed over me. We didn't get far before I heard a sharp whistle. I turned around to see the man from earlier standing among the trees, without shoes. The woman's voice came from nearby, asking if we had caught anything. My heart raced. I grabbed my sister and urged her to run back to camp. She bolted ahead, and I followed, constantly checking behind me. We made it back safely, breathless and panicked. Our parents took us seriously but couldn't find any clear evidence of the strange couple. Later, when we returned to the lake, they were gone. But the unsettling memory of that day has stayed with me ever since. I took a break from going camping for a few years, but recently, I decided to go on my first trip in a long time. There were 4 of us in total. I invited some friends who had camped with me before, and one of them brought their new fiancée. I reserved a campsite that I was familiar with, but in the time I had been away, it had changed from how I remembered it. The trees looked healthier, the bushes had grown thicker, and overall, the vegetation was more vibrant and plentiful. The walking paths that used to wind through the woods around the campsite were now completely overgrown. It seemed like people had forgotten about this spot during the lockdown, and the forest had taken back its space. My fellow campers, however, didn't seem to appreciate the changes. In the past, we all shared a common understanding of respecting nature, but this time, their behavior was different. I couldn't entirely blame them. After all, the last few years had been tough and they probably just wanted to unwind. But it's always important to remember that when you're in nature, you're a visitor in its domain. As soon as we set up camp, my friends started acting like a bunch of college kids. They were breaking branches off trees, claiming they were in the way, drinking too much beer and throwing the empty cans into the woods, and even spreading hot coals from the fire around the campsite just to watch them catch and then stomp them out before it got dangerous. They were breaking all the rules. I got annoyed and told them to knock it off, but they just handed me a beer and told me to relax. I tried to make the best of the situation, but as the evening went on, so did my frustration. While everyone else gathered around the fire, I decided to turn in early. I felt restless, though I wasn't physically tired, just in a bad mood. They were all being loud and yelling about nonsense. I didn't check the time, but I knew it was late when they finally quieted down. It was like the whole forest exhaled when they stopped talking and fell asleep. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of insects, long enough to realize I was the only one still awake. I got up to go to the bathroom one last time. I crawled out of my tent and walked to the edge of the campsite. While standing there, my eyes naturally drifted off into the darkness of the woods. When I looked up, I could see the crescent moon peeking through the tree branches. When I looked forward, it was just shadows and trees, until I noticed something else. A pair of eyes staring right at me, reflecting a pale white glow. I jumped in surprise and quickly covered myself, glancing away for just a second. When I looked back, the eyes had moved closer. Now, I could make out a bit more detail in the moonlight. It seemed to be a person standing in the open. There was something deeply unsettling about them. I knew I should call out, but I was almost too scared to speak. "Who's there?" I called out. When there was no reply, I decided to shine my flashlight. I fumbled through my pocket for it, briefly looking away again. When I turned the light on and pointed it at them, they had moved again. This time, they were only about 30 feet away. I swore in fear, but now, with the light, I could see more clearly. It was my friend's fiancée. She was wearing the same clothes I had last seen her in, and she looked exactly as she normally did, except for one thing. The whites of her eyes had a strange, eerie reflection, and she was standing stiffly, as though held up by invisible strings. "Haley," I called out. "What are you doing?" There was a pause before she answered, but it wasn't her own voice I heard. It was mine, repeating my words back to me. "What are you doing?" The voice was identical to mine, though Haley wasn't known for any sort of mimicry. Confused, I stepped back, and instantly, she moved forward, matching my steps. I stopped, and so did she. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and for a moment, I hoped maybe she was just sick or something. But if this wasn't Haley, I had no idea what I was looking at. "It's late," I said, still trying to reason with her. "You shouldn't be out here. Are you okay? Do you need help?" Once again, she repeated my words, using my voice. "You shouldn't be out here." A shiver ran down my spine. I suddenly realized that whatever was going on, I wasn't prepared to deal with it alone. I started walking backward toward the tents, keeping my eyes on Haley as she mimicked my every move, almost gliding across the ground like a puppet. When I reached my friend's tent, Haley had moved fully into the clearing. I knocked frantically on the tent, calling for her fiancé. "Stephen, get up. Something's wrong with Haley," I shouted. Stephen groaned and peeked out of the tent, confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Haley's right here." He pulled back the flap of the tent, and I saw Haley lying in her sleeping bag, just starting to wake up from all the noise. "What the?" I muttered in disbelief. But she was just out there. I spun around, shining my flashlight where I had just seen her. There was nothing, no one there at all. "Are you okay, man?" Stephen asked, clearly concerned. "You look a little freaked out." "I am freaked out," I shouted. "I don't know what I just saw, but it wasn't normal." He pointed into the woods, where there was indeed nothing to be seen. He tried to calm me down, telling me I was probably just tired or imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. I couldn't relax, so I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, stirring the coals and keeping watch, too on edge to sleep. Every noise I heard made me jump, convinced that I would see those glowing eyes staring back at me again. At the first light of dawn, I made up my mind. I woke everyone up and insisted we pack up and leave. I wasn't taking any chances. Despite their grumbling and complaints, they didn't have much of a choice since we had used my car and much of my gear. The ride back was silent. Since then, I haven't been on good terms with any of them. They think I need to get my head checked, but I know what I saw. If anyone has heard of something like this, I'd appreciate some guidance. I suspect that whatever it was, it had gotten comfortable during the time people were absent, and my group hadn't exactly been respectful enough to be welcomed back. Either that, or maybe I am losing it. But one thing's for sure, I don't think I'll be going camping again anytime soon. Been lurking on this forum for a while, so I figured it was time to share my own story. Luckily, it's not one of those creepy guys staring at you stories. This is the story of how me and my best friend from university nearly got killed in the wilderness. I know what you're thinking. Nearly got killed must mean a lot of eerie looks and very little actual danger. Well, stick around because I've got both the story and a scar to back it up. I'm not sure what got into me and my buddy Calvin during our second year at North Denver University, but we fell hard into a survivalist rabbit hole. We lived off campus, both working part-time, and with the nearby snow-capped mountain range practically in our backyard, we had started hiking to stay fit and blow off steam. We had gotten into hiking during our first year when we were still living on campus. But after moving into a small apartment off Logan Avenue, we had one movie night that changed everything. Sometime in mid-November, we watched a film called Stranded. If I remember right, Stranded is based on the real-life story of a South American soccer team whose plane crashed in the Andes. The survivors, cold and injured, had to eat the bodies of their dead friends to survive, gaining enough strength from the cannibalism to eventually save themselves. The movie was intense and captivating, especially because it was based on true events. Calvin and I couldn't stop asking each other what we would do in that situation. Mainly, we debated how hungry we'd have to be before eating one of our dead buddies became an option. Obviously, we weren't eager to test that out, but we figured we could do the next best thing. Head up into the mountains during peak snowfall and camp for a night or two, just to see if we could hack it. Now, here's where I say, don't try this at home, folks. Winter camping is risky under the best conditions, and trying it in the dead of winter is beyond reckless. Naturally, being two overconfident, college-aged guys, Calvin and I thought it was an epic idea and immediately started planning a weekend camping trip for after the holidays. We kept organizing during Christmas break, and the first weekend back after New Year's, we drove up to Echo Valley Park near Sawyer Peak. We parked the car there and hiked off into the snowy woods, heading toward Old Man Mountain. After walking for a couple of miles, we found a decent spot among some pine trees, set down our stuff, and started clearing space to set up camp. I won't bore you with every miserable detail of how awful it was, but holy hell, it was terrible. Everything stayed wet, making it impossible to keep a fire going, and we barely slept. It sucked so much that we decided to pack up at the crack of dawn, somewhere around 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and hike back to the car as soon as the sun gave us some light to navigate. I used my camp stove to brew us some coffee inside the tent. After we were warmed up, we started packing. Calvin finished a little earlier than me, unzipped the tent, and told me he was stepping out to take a leak. I just grunted, half asleep, and kept gathering my things. A minute or so later, Calvin came back, squatted by the tent entrance, and asked me, "Is your knife within reach?" The first thing that came to mind was a bear. Sometimes they wake up from hibernation early and, without food around, they can pose a real threat to campers. But when I asked Calvin what he saw, he just said, "There's a guy. He was watching me while I was peeing." I felt a strange sense of relief. At least it wasn't a starving, angry bear, so when Calvin told me it was just a guy, I almost laughed. So what if some early hiker happened upon him mid-pee? No big deal, right? I even joked with him about it until Calvin told me the man had a gun. That didn't fully sink in at first either. Sure, it was way out of season for hunting anything besides maybe elk, but it wasn't uncommon to see someone with a rifle in these parts. Still, Calvin seemed uneasy, but I just couldn't grasp the seriousness of it all. I was still waking up and focused on getting the hell out of there. The next thing I knew, Calvin turned his head quickly, then suddenly screamed at me, "Get out of the tent!" I hadn't finished packing, but I scrambled out as fast as I could. That's when I finally saw what had him so freaked out. Standing a few yards away was a lone hunter, his face completely hidden by a ski mask. He didn't say anything as we slowly got to our feet and backed away from the tent. We tried talking to him, apologizing if we had unknowingly trespassed and assuring him we'd leave, but he didn't respond. Then, without a word, he raised his rifle and pointed it directly at us. What happened next was a blur. The moment I saw him raise the gun, both Calvin and I turned and bolted. The sound of the first shot was deafening, echoing through the woods as we sprinted for our lives. The gap between the first and second shot felt like forever, and I remember thinking that any second now I was going to get hit. Then, bang, the second shot went off and I felt something slam into the back of my left thigh. I collapsed but quickly realized I could still move, so I pushed myself up with Calvin's help and we kept running. I knew I had been hit. The initial impact hurt like hell, but what stood out more was the weird mix of sensations. Warm blood poured down my leg as I ran, but the cold air made the wound feel icy. It was surreal and terrifying, something I never want to experience again. Long story short, we eventually made it down the mountain. Either the hunter couldn't get another clear shot or decided to flee before anyone could call the authorities. I got lucky. The bullet hadn't hit me directly. Instead, it had struck a tree, causing fragments to slice into my thigh. The doctors told me that if the bullet had splintered differently, or if I had been running any slower, the fragment could have severed my femoral artery. I would have bled out in minutes, but that didn't happen, and for that, I'm beyond grateful. As for the shooter, the police questioned a few hunters in the area, but no arrests were made, and no one was ever charged with what happened to us. My theory? The guy wasn't some serial killer or anything like that. I think he was just an unstable individual who thought, why not? No one's around to stop me. There are people like that out there, and as terrifying as it is to think about, we happened to run into one of them. On the morning of Sunday, December 6, 2009, Sarah Johnson took her two young boys to a local church service in Westville, Utah. Westville is home to roughly 140,000 residents and is often considered an ideal community for raising a family. Sarah and her husband, Mark, had relocated there a few years prior to be closer to his family. Mark worked in finance while Sarah took a position at a local bank. Over time, the Johnsons seemed to settle into family life, appearing to friends and neighbors as the picture-perfect family. However, hidden beneath the surface were tensions, and during the 2009 holiday season, an unsettling mystery began that would alter the town's image forever. After church, Sarah drove her boys home, and that afternoon, a friend stopped by for a visit. The friend later reported that Sarah seemed happy and gave no indication of any concerns. The following morning, Mark's mother, Linda, received a call from her grandson's daycare, notifying her that the boys had not been dropped off, and no one was answering calls at home. Worried, Linda and Mark's sister, Jennifer, drove to the house. They knocked on the door but got no response, and when both Sarah and Mark continued to be unreachable, they contacted the police. When the officers arrived, they feared there might be a gas leak, so with Linda's permission, they forced entry into the house. The house was empty, which initially relieved them, as it ruled out a carbon monoxide accident. However, upon further inspection, they found two large fans directed at a damp couch in the living room. This, combined with Sarah's personal items still in the house, including her purse and car keys but not her phone, raised suspicion, but there were no clear signs of foul play. Later that day, Mark returned home with the boys, explaining that he had taken them on a spontaneous camping trip the night before. The police found his story odd, particularly given that he hadn't informed the daycare, but Mark maintained that he had simply lost track of time. When officers checked the location Mark claimed they had camped at, they found no evidence that anyone had been there recently. Mark insisted he must have been mistaken about the location, which only increased the police's suspicions. As the investigation continued, police began looking into Mark's background. Born in Tacoma, Washington in 1975, Mark had a troubled childhood. He had grown up in a volatile household, raised by an abusive father who held deep resentment toward the church. These early experiences seemed to affect Mark deeply, leading to aggressive behavior, including a disturbing incident where he threatened his mother with a knife. His parents divorced when he was a teenager, and while his behavior improved somewhat after his father left, there were lingering concerns about his emotional stability. In the late 1990s, Mark moved to Seattle to attend college. While there, he met a woman named Catherine at a church event, and they started dating. However, as their relationship progressed, Mark became controlling, restricting her contact with her family and friends. Catherine eventually ended the relationship after moving out under the pretense of visiting family. Following this breakup, Mark moved back to Tacoma and began attending a local religious study group. It was at one of these gatherings that he met Sarah. They married quickly after 6 months of dating and initially moved in with Mark's estranged father. However, their living situation quickly soured. Mark's father began behaving inappropriately towards Sarah, secretly recording her and even stealing personal items. After 2 years, Sarah confronted Mark's father, and Mark decided to move the family to Utah in an effort to distance themselves from his father's influence. Despite the move, the marriage was strained. Mark's controlling tendencies reappeared, and he began to distance himself from the church, leading to increased tension with Sarah, who was devout in her faith. By 2009, their financial situation had worsened. Mark's spending habits led to bankruptcy, and while Sarah worked tirelessly to support the family, Mark continued to pursue risky business ventures. In 2008, Sarah discovered that Mark had resumed contact with his father, despite his earlier promises to cut ties. This revelation led to a major confrontation, during which Mark became violently angry, smashing household items. After this incident, Sarah began keeping a secret record of the ongoing issues in their marriage, including a video documenting the destruction Mark caused and a letter expressing her fears for her safety. On December 9, 2009, police invited Mark to the station for questioning. Meanwhile, they executed a search warrant at the Johnson home, where they discovered a $1 million life insurance policy in Sarah's name and a letter she had written expressing concerns for her life. Small traces of Sarah's blood were found in the house, along with blood from an unidentified male. Mark explained the blood as a cooking accident and maintained his innocence. However, with no evidence of Sarah's death, the police could not arrest him, and Mark was released. Throughout 2010, police continued to gather evidence against Mark. They discovered that he had emptied Sarah's retirement accounts, canceled her appointments, and withdrawn the boys from daycare. Even more disturbingly, one of Mark's co-workers recalled a conversation in which Mark had asked where to dispose of a body, referencing abandoned mines in the Utah desert. In interviews with their eldest son, Charlie, he mentioned that Sarah had been with them on the camping trip, even drawing a picture at daycare showing his mother in the trunk of their car. This, combined with Mark's erratic behavior and refusal to cooperate with authorities, only deepened the mystery surrounding Sarah's disappearance. As the investigation unfolded, Mark moved back to Washington to live with his father. The relationship between Mark and Sarah's family deteriorated as he continued to publicly claim his innocence. In 2011, his father was arrested on charges related to inappropriate images of children, which further strained the family's relationships. By 2012, Mark had lost custody of his children, and during a supervised visit on February 5, 2012, tragedy struck. When a social worker arrived to oversee the visit, Mark locked her out of the house, and moments later, a massive explosion rocked the property. Inside, Mark had killed both of his sons before setting the house on fire, ending the tragic saga in a horrific and final act of violence. When my wife and I first got married, she'd often bring me along to these huge family reunions. They were usually held in the middle of nowhere, often at a ranch or some rented cabins. Many would bring trailers or set up tents. This was the kind of reunion where everyone showed up, even great-grandma in her wheelchair. As the new son-in-law, I knew I had to make the effort to attend. The first few times I went, I was amazed at how many people were there. The first day would usually have about 100 people, and by the second day, that number would double. People often asked if her family was Mormon or Mexican, but they weren't either, just a large Southern family. One year, we gathered by a lake that was off the beaten path. There were a few small cabins rented out for the family, and they were already full, so my wife and I set up our tent by the lakeshore. I preferred this anyway, as I grew up camping and could fish whenever I wanted. It also gave me some space from the 200 or so relatives wandering around. Along with us were our chocolate lab, Seymour, and our son Jack, who was about 5 years old at the time. After setting up camp, we made our usual rounds, hugging Aunt Betsy, shaking hands with Grandpa Dill, and chatting with all the nieces, nephews, and cousins. While I might make it sound like these gatherings were a hassle, they were generally fun, especially at the start. Playing with the kids and catching up with everyone was usually enjoyable. But by the second or third day, things started to get tense. The kids would get bored and cranky, which annoyed the adults. People would start drinking too much, and eventually arguments would break out. None of that had happened yet, though, so we were still having a good time on day one. There were trails leading off in every direction, so I led some hikes with my son and any cousins who wanted to join. We had fun exploring, and after getting a feel for the area, I started taking them into more interesting terrain. We found a dry wash with some geodes and a burrow under a tree where animals had been sleeping. There were bones scattered around, probably from a cow or some small game, maybe a deer, but nothing concerning. We made a loop through a thicket of trees and picked up the original trail. As we moved into the trees, I spotted a hunter's blind and froze. I wasn't experienced with hunting, but I could tell that no one was inside. I told the kids to move ahead and hide behind a fallen tree for cover while I investigated. Quietly, I approached the blind and noticed that the zipper flap in the back was hanging open. Inside, everything was neat. There was a stool by a window flap, but no people, no shell casings, nothing. The nylon was sun-bleached and weathered, so it had likely been there for years. I signaled to the kids that it was safe and we headed back to camp. I didn't think much more about it. That evening, after dinner, we sat by the fire with Uncle Pete and his kids when we heard a long coyote howl in the distance. The kids scrambled, and the adults laughed it off. The howls were probably a couple of miles away, and with over 100 people there, many of them armed, no one was worried. The kids, however, were unaware of this and found the howls fascinating. Throughout the night, we heard the coyotes howling back and forth across the hills as we enjoyed our meal and the fire. The next day brought more family members, and with about 70 more people showing up, the reunion was in full swing. The day was filled with activities to keep everyone entertained. Treasure hunts, races, potato cannons, butter churning, and whittling classes. These reunions always encouraged bonding among the kids and taught them valuable lessons. By the afternoon, though, the mood started to shift. The kids were complaining about the heat and boredom, which led to minor arguments between families. I kept an eye on things while Jack and I went fishing and played with Seymour. After a little hike, we returned to camp for dinner. That evening, as we sat by the fire, someone pointed out a figure by the lake. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like someone was leaning against a tree, swaying slightly. We joked that it was probably a drunk cousin or uncle, and I went back to my dinner. But after 10 or 15 minutes, someone mentioned that the figure was still there. This time, when I looked, it felt like they were facing us, staring at our camp. I pulled Jack closer, and Seymour began growling, pacing back and forth at the end of his leash. Aunt Toddy suggested it might be Luke, a cousin with a tendency to get blackout drunk. She thought someone should go help him. As the youngest guy at the fire, I was volunteered. I handed Jack to my wife and headed toward the figure, feeling uneasy. With over 200 family members nearby, I wasn't too worried, but I couldn't shake the memory of the hunter's blind. What if this wasn't Luke or any relative? What if it was someone else? When I was about 20 or 30 feet away, I shined a flashlight at the figure and was shocked to see not a man, but a large black bear leaning against the tree, sniffing the air. It dropped to all fours and began following me. I stopped, unsure of what to do, and the bear also paused. Then I noticed a small bear cub nearby, making the situation even worse. I yelled back to camp, "Bear!" and hurried back. The bear followed for a short distance before stopping. Soon, a wall of family members had gathered, some with pistols and rifles. Uncle Dill calmly asked where the bear was. I pointed it out with my flashlight, and everyone murmured in awe. Some suggested shooting it, but the older relatives decided against it. Instead, they had some of the teenagers light sticks and wave them in the air, shouting at the bear until it retreated into the woods. It was actually fascinating to watch, but my wife and I were on edge for the rest of the night, especially with Jack and Seymour in a tent. The family kept a lookout through the night, but thankfully, the bear didn't return. However, there were a few more sightings over the next day. Later, we learned that the cabins and land we rented were out-of-season bear hunting lodges. The discounted price made sense, but we hadn't realized we'd booked our reunion in bear country. I grew up in a small town called Clearwater, nestled along a winding river, just a few hours' drive from the city of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. It was a wonderful place to be raised, especially since for nearly half the year, the town turned into a full-fledged winter paradise. Naturally, winter sports were a huge part of my childhood, alongside all the fun snowy activities like building snowmen or having snowball fights with my best friend, who lived on 53rd Avenue. Alberta was home, and I always figured the furthest I'd move would be down to Calgary for work. However, life took me further than I ever expected when my career led me to relocate to Sydney, Australia. I moved there in 2008, met someone special, got married, and we decided to build our lives and start a family in Australia. Since my relatives were able to travel more easily, they visited Sydney once or twice a year to see their grandchildren during their early years. By the time my daughter Amy turned 6 and my son Ben was 4, neither had experienced snow in person. They had only heard tales of their father's snowy homeland. We decided it was time to change that and planned a trip back to Alberta for Christmas in 2018. Amy was thrilled, but Ben had no idea what awaited him. Once we arrived in Calgary and drove the 90 miles to my parents' home, both kids were amazed by the thick, fluffy blankets of snow lining the highway. It was a magical experience to show them my hometown, and they absolutely loved visiting their grandparents. But nothing captured their attention quite like the snow. In Australia, Christmas is just like it is in Canada, except for one key difference: the weather. While it's deep winter up north, it's the height of summer in the southern hemisphere. Seeing stores decorated with fake snow when it's scorching outside is always a bit surreal. I often joke that Australians would happily cover the entire country in frost for a day just to match the holiday atmosphere. So, for my kids, having the scenery line up with the holiday spirit was like a trip to a theme park, only much cheaper. They spent nearly every moment playing in the snow, trying out all the same things I did as a child. Even wearing all the heavy winter gear was a novelty for them. Amy once joked that she couldn't decide whether she felt more like an astronaut or a polar explorer. They enjoyed it so much that when my wife saw an ad for a winter camping experience at a place called Oak Ridge Lodge, we jumped at the opportunity to book a night in one of their cozy family yurts. We drove up there on December 21st, arrived around noon, and by 1:30 we were outside building snowmen. We played for a few hours, and then as the sky began to darken, my wife headed back to the yurt to start dinner on the small camping stove provided by the lodge. Meanwhile, the kids and I continued playing in the snow. After a particularly fierce snowball fight, Where Amy and Ben teamed up against me, we all started feeling pretty hungry. We were only about 50 yards from the yurt, so I told Amy to watch her brother while I quickly checked on dinner. When I returned, Amy was working on the base of yet another snowman, but Ben was nowhere in sight. I figured he couldn't have gone far, but after scanning the area and not seeing him, I asked Amy where he was. She glanced around, her face turning pale with worry, and nervously said, "I don't know." I could tell she feared I might be upset with her, and while a small part of me was frustrated, that feeling was completely overtaken by a growing sense of panic. Thankfully, I noticed Ben's small footprints in the snow, so I followed them. I trailed his little boot prints until they led me to something that filled me with dread, an icy stream. It wasn't particularly deep or wide, but it was just the right size for a small child to fall into and potentially be swept away. I ran up and down the banks, yelling Ben's name and desperately scanning the water, fearing the worst. My daughter followed me, and I could see the terror in her eyes as she tried to understand what was happening. I was about to lose hope when I suddenly heard Ben's voice. I spun around and saw him on the other side of the stream, trudging through the snow as if nothing had happened. He didn't seem scared or distressed, just calmly walking in his winter coat and boots. I rushed across the stream and scooped him up in my arms, trying not to show how scared I had been. Though I didn't scold him, I must have transmitted some of my fear because he started crying when he saw Amy, who was already in tears. We headed back to the yurt, where my wife, confused and worried, met us at the door. After I explained what had happened, she was upset with all of us. But mainly, we were just relieved that Ben was safe. After dinner, we put the kids to bed. But before tucking Ben in, I couldn't shake a question that had been nagging me. So I asked him, "Ben, how did you get across that stream?" His answer sent a chill down my spine. "The snowman carried me." Now, of course, I knew a snowman hadn't carried him across the stream, but someone had. The idea made me feel sick. I carefully asked Ben if the snowman might have been someone dressed in white or someone with snow on their clothes, but he just shook his head and insisted, "The snowman carried me." Then, before I could ask anything else, he drifted off to sleep. I immediately told my wife what Ben had said, and within minutes we were packing up our things. There was no way we were staying another night. We informed a lodge representative on our way out, but we didn't stick around long enough to see what they would do. We drove back home that same night, not even thinking to ask for a refund. We were too shaken. The next morning, I contacted the police to report what had happened. They called us back a day later to confirm our worst fears. On the other side of the stream, alongside Ben's small footprints, they found a set of much larger footprints. Whoever had carried Ben wasn't a snowman, but likely a person who'd taken him, thankfully letting him go before anything worse happened. Ben later told us that the person who carried him had been wearing a white hat or light-colored clothing. They walked with him through the woods for a bit, then set him down and left. Ben heard me calling and followed my voice until we were reunited. When I asked him if the person spoke or if he was scared, he simply said, "No, it was strange." Ben wasn't the type of kid to trust strangers easily, but he hadn't cried or struggled when this unknown person picked him up. To this day, the thought of someone taking my son without him even realizing the danger sends shivers down my spine. Hello, I'm Mark, and I work as a researcher at the University of Alberta. My area of expertise is atmospheric science, which involves studying weather and climate from a variety of perspectives, ranging from chemistry to soil science, mathematics, and engineering. Over the past few years, much of our attention has been on climate change, but earlier this year, I got the opportunity to participate in a unique and unexpected research program in collaboration with the University of Eastern Asia, based in Kyrgyzstan. Our task? to evaluate and verify a collection of previously unexamined research data recently provided by the Kyrgyz government. Before explaining why this was necessary, it's important to understand two things. First, unlike many other former Soviet countries that faced turmoil after the collapse of the USSR, Kyrgyzstan's political power was consolidated quickly by a man named Kentar Nazarov. This man was, and still is, completely unpredictable. For instance, he renamed the capital city after himself, imported sand from the Maldives to create an artificial beach, and commissioned the construction of massive, strange buildings with no apparent function. These weren't just monuments or statues, they were full-scale skyscrapers that were completely hollow on the inside. Their sole purpose was to give the capital city, known at that time as Nassar, a futuristic appearance. In his rush to solidify power after the fall of the Soviet Union, Nazarov had his loyal followers seize every piece of government-owned property across the nation, including scientific research stations previously operated by the Soviets. These facilities were scattered throughout places like Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. After the USSR's collapse, research data from these institutions was finally shared with Western universities, although it took longer in Russia's case. By the late 1990s, however, Western academics could access Soviet-era research data. But the situation in Kyrgyzstan was different. Nazarov's regime took control of all research data, locking it away under the guise of protecting it from prying foreign eyes. Whether he truly believed he was safeguarding his country's assets or simply wanted to maintain control, much of the Soviet-era research data in Kyrgyzstan remained inaccessible until he stepped down in early 2022. Afterward, the two largest universities in Kyrgyzstan, one named after Nazarov, gained access to the data and shared it with our partners at the University of Eastern Asia, which in turn allowed us at the University of Alberta to begin our work. Our first challenge was gaining access to the old Kyrgyz research data. The second was authenticating it. Describing Soviet-era science as outdated would be generous, though credit should be given where it's due, especially when it comes to space exploration and military research. But in other fields, Soviet ideology often overshadowed scientific accuracy, leading to disastrous consequences. Take, for instance, Lysenko, the USSR's leading agricultural scientist during Stalin's rule. He once declared that geneticists were enemies of the people and dismissed the use of mathematics in biology. His bizarre theories caused widespread famine in both the Soviet Union and China, and those who dared criticize him were imprisoned or killed. So how did such a madman rise to power? By manipulating data, using exaggerated language, falsified numbers, and flawed research methods, which dictated farming practices for millions. And that brings us to our second challenge, authenticating this research data. My job, after the translation of the documents, was to comb through them, compare them with Western research, and determine their reliability. This involved endless hours of reading, mostly on mundane meteorological studies, which was so dull that I often found myself reaching for coffee just to stay awake. But after weeks of sifting through a mountain of research papers, I came across two reports that grabbed my attention like nothing before. Both were lengthy, and while the average reader might not fully grasp their significance, I'll summarize them and then share my own, albeit speculative, conclusion.